Welcome to Shadow Frames, where forgotten images reveal their darkest secrets. The late 19th century brought with it a revolution in how humanity documented itself. The camera, once a novelty accessible only to the wealthy, gradually found its way into communities across the world. Church gatherings, social events, and family portraits became frozen moments, preserved in sepia tones and silver plates for generations to come. Among the countless photographs from this era, one stands apart. A church gathering captured in 1895, seemingly innocent at first glance, yet harboring something that defies explanation. The photograph shows what appears to be a harvest celebration outside a small stone church. Rows of parishioners stand in their Sunday best, men in dark suits with high collars, women in floor-length dresses with cinched waists, hair pulled tightly back as was the fashion. A banner hanging between two oak trees reads, "Autumn Blessing, 1895. The pastor stands at center, Bible in hand, his expression appropriately solemn for the occasion. It is, in almost every way, a typical community photograph of its time. The image quality has the expected softness around the edges, that ghostly quality that old photographs possess, where the subjects had to remain utterly still for several seconds while the exposure completed. But in the front row stands a child who has become the subject of intense scrutiny and debate among those who have studied this image. A young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, in a white dress with a dark sash. Unlike the other children who gaze directly at the camera with the stiff posture their parents surely instructed, this child appears wrong. Her face is blurred, but not in the way movement typically affects these old photographs. Where movement would create a smearing effect in one direction, this child's features seem to radiate outward, as though her face is simultaneously turned in every possible direction at once. The effect is deeply unsettling. Some sections of her face appear to be looking directly at the camera, while others seem to gaze off to the sides, upward, and even backward. The blur doesn't extend to her clothing or hair, only her facial features, as though her head exists in multiple positions simultaneously within the same physical space. What makes this particularly disturbing is the technical impossibility. Photography experts who have examined the original glass plate negative confirm there is no evidence of manipulation. The plate shows no signs of multiple exposure techniques or darkroom alterations. The photographer himself, one Thomas Merritt, made no mention of anything unusual when he catalogued the image. His ledger simply notes, "Harvest Gathering, St. Mary's, September 25th, 1895. 23 adults, 9 children present," yet he counted wrong. There are 23 adults and 8 normal children, and 1, something else. Something that wore the form of a child, but perhaps existed differently in the moment the camera's eye opened to capture the light of that autumn day. What happened to this child? Was she truly there among the congregation, or was something else standing in her place? And why does no church record from St. Mary's mention any disturbances or concerns from that otherwise unremarkable church gathering? What complicates matters further is that no one in the photograph seems disturbed by the child's presence. Each parishioner stands with practiced dignity, their expressions ranging from stern to mildly pleasant, but none betray the horror one would expect if something supernatural manifested in their midst. This suggests whatever anomaly affected the child was imperceptible to those present, visible only through the camera's unblinking eye. Parish records from St. Mary's have been meticulously preserved, providing a window into the community that gathered that autumn day. The church served a small farming community where life revolved around harvests and changing seasons. 1895 had been particularly bountiful after 3 years of drought, explaining the celebratory nature of the gathering. I tracked down the church registry, yellowed pages filled with careful cursive documenting baptisms, marriages, and funerals. Each family name from the photograph appears in these records, all except one. No child matching the girl's description appears in any baptismal record or school enrollment from the surrounding county. Most disturbing is what happened in the weeks following the photograph. Thomas Merritt's journal, discovered in his great-granddaughter's attic in 2007, contains increasingly agitated entries after developing this particular image. October 3rd, 1895. Cannot shake the feeling of being observed while working in the dark room. When developing the St. Mary's plates, witnessed strange shadows moving beyond the red lamp's glow. Must have been exhaustion. October 12th. Dreamt of the harvest gathering again. All stood as they were except the Emerson child who walked toward me, face shifting like smoke in wind. Woke sweating despite the autumn chill. The Emerson child. A name at last. Yet church records show the Emersons had only 2 sons, both teenagers in 1895. No daughter appears in any family record. Later entries grow increasingly disturbed as Merritt describes glimpsing a small figure in white in his peripheral vision. By November, his handwriting deteriorates, and he mentions faces swimming beneath her face and eyes looking from where no eyes should be. His final entry, dated December 1st, simply reads, "She waits at the edge of the frame, always at the edge of what can be seen." Thomas Merritt was found dead in his darkroom 2 days later, officially attributed to heart failure. He was 43. Perhaps most chilling is what happened to the original photograph. After being displayed at the church for several weeks, Reverend William Hargrove removed it, claiming the glass had cracked. When the church burned down in 1926, many assumed the photograph was lost forever, until 1978, when it resurfaced at an estate sale in a neighboring county. The elderly seller claimed her mother received it as a gift from a photographer's widow, decades earlier. The woman kept it wrapped in black cloth, never displaying it, reportedly because the child in front keeps multiplying. The photograph changed hands several times after its rediscovery, leaving a disturbing pattern in its wake. Each owner reported the same progression of experiences: initial fascination, growing unease, and eventually terror. A linguistics professor who possessed the image for 6 months in 1983 documented how the child's apparent directions seemed to increase. In his notes, he claimed that what initially appeared to be 5 or 6 simultaneous facial orientations had, by the end of his ownership, become innumerable. I located 3 living individuals who had briefly owned the photograph. They spoke reluctantly, one refusing to discuss it after dark. Martha Klein, now in her 70s, described how the image seemed to change when viewed in different light. Under sunlight, the child looked merely blurred. By lamplight, her face multiplied, like watching a kaleidoscope of human features all occupying the same space. The most compelling account came from Dr. Eleanor Whiting, an art conservator who examined the photograph in 1994. Using then cutting-edge digital scanning technology, she attempted to resolve the child's features. The computer simply couldn't process what it was seeing. Dr. Whiting told me during our interview, her hands trembling slightly despite the years between her and the photograph. Each pixel scan returned different data. The software crashed repeatedly. On our final attempt, the scanner captured something the human eye couldn't perceive. She provided me with a printout of that scan. Where the child's face should be was not a blur, but a spiral pattern of miniature faces, each with distinct expressions ranging from placid smiles to abject terror. Each tiny face harbored another spiral of even smaller faces within its features, suggesting an infinite regression. Whatever that child was, Dr. Whiting said, it existed in more dimensions than we perceive. The camera somehow flattened this multi-dimensional presence into 2 dimensions, resulting in the blur we see. Local historian Jeffrey Palmer offered yet another theory when I visited St. Mary's former site. Now nothing but foundation stones and an overgrown cemetery. He suggested I cross-reference the church's location with older maps from the area. This region was sacred to indigenous peoples long before European settlement, Palmer explained, unfolding brittle maps dating back to the 1700s. Their oral histories speak of thin places where the barriers between worlds grow permeable during certain celestial alignments. St. Mary's, it turns out, was built directly atop one such site. According to Palmer's research, a rare planetary alignment occurred in September 1895, precisely when Merritt took his photograph. Most disturbing of all was my visit to the Emerson family plot. Despite church records showing no daughter, a small, weathered headstone stands apart from the family grouping. The inscription reads only E.E., and the date's 1886. The question mark in place of a death date sent a chill through me that the autumn wind couldn't explain. The current whereabouts of the original photograph remain unknown after its last documented owner, a collector of occult artifacts, disappeared in 2011. His apartment was found empty except for a camera set on a tripod. Lens pointed at the wall where neighbors reported he had displayed his prize possession. The camera contained no film, but a child-sized handprint was found on the lens, its fingers elongated and pointing in physically impossible directions. The photograph's trail led me to an assisted living facility in Mapleton, where I found myself sitting across from Eliza Carter, aged 103. She claimed to be the last living person who had attended the 1895 church gathering, though she had been merely a child of 3 at the time. They never spoke of her, Eliza whispered, her cloudy eyes fixed on something beyond the window. The adults pretended not to see, but we children knew. Emily Emerson was there, but not there. This was the first confirmation I'd found of the child's full name. According to Eliza, Emily Emerson had died of scarlet fever in 1892, 3 years before the photograph was taken. Her mother couldn't accept it, Eliza continued. Mrs. Emerson spoke to empty chairs, set places at the table. The sons eventually went to live with an aunt. Mr. Emerson tried to have her committed, but the community protected her. Rural folk understood grief differently then. I showed Eliza a reproduction of the photograph. Her reaction was immediate. She recoiled, hand trembling as she reached for the cross hanging around her neck. "They couldn't see what the camera saw," she whispered. "But I could. Children always can." Emily wasn't just in one place. She was wherever her mother looked for her, everywhere at once. Eliza described how Mrs. Emerson insisted her daughter attend the harvest gathering. The adults humored her delusion, leaving space in the front row where Emily stood. Thomas Merritt, setting up his camera, reportedly asked if the empty space should be closed, but Mrs. Emerson became hysterical. "Emily is standing right there," she had insisted, "right there in her white dress." According to Eliza, something changed the moment the photograph was taken. The air got thick, like breathing through honey, and Emily appeared, not like you and me, but like ripples on water, folding over and into herself. I located medical records from the county hospital dated October 1895 through February 1896. 6 children from St. Mary's Parish were treated for an undiagnosed illness characterized by persistent disorientation and visual disturbances. All had been present at the harvest gathering. All recovered except one, a 3-year-old girl whose symptoms progressed until she could no longer recognize her parents because, as she reportedly told the doctor, their faces look in all directions at once. That child was Eliza Carter. "They said I recovered," Eliza told me, her fingers tracing patterns in the air. "But I only learned to see the world as others do. The truth is still there, beneath the surface. Reality isn't fixed. It bends. Emily existed in those bends." As our interview concluded, Eliza asked to hold the reproduction. Her fingers traced the blurred face with surprising precision, following patterns I couldn't discern. "You shouldn't pursue this," she warned, returning the image. "Those who look for Emily have a way of finding her, or rather, she finds them. The photographer saw first, but he wasn't the last." That night in my hotel room, reviewing my recorder, I discovered something impossible. Though Eliza had spoken clearly during our interview, the recording contained stretches where her voice split into multiple overlapping versions of itself, each saying slightly different words simultaneously, creating an incomprehensible chorus of alternatives. Just like the child's face, looking in every direction at once. The blurred recording disturbed me more than I cared to admit. I spent the night replaying it at various speeds, trying to disentangle the overlapping voices. At half speed, I could almost make out phrases that raised the hair on my neck. Between the moments and "she collects those who notice her." Sleep-deprived and unsettled, I drove to the county records office at dawn. A sympathetic archivist granted me access to property records from the 1890s. The Emerson homestead had been abandoned after Helena Emerson's death in 1897. Suicide, according to the death certificate, though details were sparse. The property remained vacant until 1923, when the land was purchased by the expanding railroad. What seized my attention was a notation in the margins of the deed transfer. Previous structure demolished as per county recommendation due to persistent architectural abnormalities. When I pressed the archivist about this unusual phrasing, she directed me to a sealed file requiring special permissions. 3 hours and considerable persuasion later, I held the engineer's report from 1923. The document described how the abandoned Emerson house had become structurally impossible. Interior measurements no longer matched exterior dimensions. Doorways occasionally led to different rooms depending on the time of day. Most disturbing was the children's bedroom, where shadows reportedly fell in directions inconsistent with light sources. The report concluded with a recommendation for immediate demolition, citing unexplainable phenomena suggesting fundamental instabilities in the structure's relationship with physical space. That afternoon, I visited the former Emerson property, now an overgrown field beside rusted railroad tracks. Nothing remained except a partial stone foundation, barely visible through tall grass. As I took photographs, an elderly man approached from a nearby farmhouse. "You're the second person this month interested in that old place," he called out. The other visitor, he explained, had been a woman in her 30s claiming to be researching local history. She'd spent hours taking measurements of the foundation and soil samples before departing abruptly. "Left her notebook behind," he added. "Found it under that big oak tree. Figured she'd come back, but it's been 3 weeks. He retrieved a weathered composition book from his porch. The name Dr. Sophia Weldon, Department of Quantum Physics, was inscribed inside the cover. The pages contained complex equations interspersed with notes about localized reality distortions and multidimensional imprints. One passage stood out. "The camera didn't create the anomaly. It merely documented what always exists beyond our perceptual limitations. The child exists in quantum superposition, occupying all possible states simultaneously. What if grief can bend reality? If consciousness can influence quantum outcomes, perhaps extreme emotional states can create ruptures in the fabric of what we perceive as fixed." The final entry, dated just 3 weeks earlier, read, "Breaking through. The mathematical model confirms it. The Emerson site retains properties consistent with my hypothesis. With proper calibration, I should be able to see what the camera saw, perhaps even communicate across the perceptual barrier." The page ended with a hastily scribbled address of a motel 20 miles north. As I thanked the farmer and turned to leave, he gripped my arm with surprising strength. "That woman," he muttered. "She came back once. Middle of the night. Standing in that foundation, talking to someone who wasn't there. When I called out, she looked at me with a face that..." He shuddered, unable to continue. "A face looking in every direction at once?" I asked. He nodded, crossing himself. "Found her camera the next morning. Nothing else." Driving toward Dr. Weldon's motel filled me with growing dread. Each mile marker seemed to warp in my peripheral vision, numbers stretching into impossible shapes before snapping back when directly observed. The physicist's abandoned camera now sat on my passenger seat, an ordinary digital SLR that felt inexplicably heavy, as though it contained more mass than its size suggested. The Lakeview Motel embodied faded 1970s charm, its paint peeling beneath flickering neon. The elderly clerk barely looked up when I inquired about Sophia Weldon. "Room 17, he muttered. "Paid through the month. Left all her things." The door to 17 stood slightly ajar. Inside, the room told the story of brilliant obsession. Every wall was covered with printouts, photographs, and equations, connected by red string, creating a web of theoretical physics and local history. The photograph of the church gathering had been enlarged and sectioned into grids, each square meticulously analyzed. On the desk sat Dr. Weldon's laptop, still running on battery power despite 3 weeks of abandonment. The screen displayed a simulation program with a 3-dimensional rendering of what appeared to be the fabric of space-time, warped and folded back upon itself like origami. Her journal entries grew increasingly frantic in the days before her disappearation. "Emily Emerson exists in a state between realities. Not a ghost, something far more complex. Her mother's grief created a quantum entanglement that the camera somehow captured. I've adapted my equipment to detect similar distortions." The final entry chilled me. "Success. Calibrated sensors detected massive reality fluctuations at the foundation site. The barrier thins at specific times. 3:27 a.m. seems optimal. I'm going back tonight with modified optical filters that should allow me to see what exists in the spaces between conventional perception. If my calculations are correct, Emily isn't looking in all directions. She's looking from all possible timelines simultaneously." On the nightstand beside an untouched bed lay a pair of modified glasses with thick, strange lenses. When I cautiously tried them on, the room seemed unchanged except for the corners, which appeared to recede into impossible distances. As I removed the glasses, I noticed something on the bathroom mirror. Equations written in lipstick, culminating in a simple message: "She can cross over where observation collapses possibility." My phone chimed with a text message from an unknown number. "You have something that belongs to me." Below it was an image, Dr. Weldon's camera, currently sitting in my car. As I stared at my phone in shock, 3 more messages arrived in rapid succession. "Time moves differently where I am. I can see you from every angle. Emily wants to meet you." The 4th and final message contained only an image, a child's drawing of a girl with multiple faces, standing beside a woman with glasses. In the background was a stick figure holding a camera. The figure had my face. I dropped the phone as if burned. watching in horror as its screen flickered between the message and something else. A blurred face, looking in every direction at once. Trembling, I gathered Dr. Weldon's research materials and fled the motel room. The clerk never looked up as I passed, his silhouette unnaturally still behind the lobby desk. Outside, twilight had descended despite my watch showing only 2 in the afternoon. My car sat alone in the parking lot, though I distinctly remembered other vehicles when I arrived. Dr. Weldon's camera remained on the passenger seat, but something about it had changed. The lens cap was off, and the display screen glowed with an image. My own face, photographed from an impossible angle above and behind me. A timestamp in the corner read, 3:27 a.m., tomorrow's date. I drove recklessly back toward town, constantly checking my rearview mirror. The road stretched longer than it should have, landmarks appearing in the wrong sequence. After what felt like hours, I arrived at the county library just before closing time. The archivist who had helped me earlier motioned me to a research desk without speaking. Her movements seemed mechanical, her face momentarily blurring when she turned away. I forced myself to focus on what I had salvaged from the motel. Dr. Weldon's notes about perceptual barriers and quantum entanglement. One document drew my attention, a photocopy of Helena Emerson's journal from 1892, the year of Emily's death. The grieving mother had written, "The doctor speaks of acceptance, but what does he know of a mother's love? I see her still, watching from corners, from behind doors. Today I glimpsed her in 5 places at once in the garden. They say I am mad, but I understand now. She exists everywhere I might look for her." Later entries described experiments with mirrors arranged to create infinite reflections. Helena wrote, "Multiple reflections create doorways. Emily appears more solid within them. I've placed 17 mirrors in her bedroom. Last night I felt her hand in mine, cold but present." A notation from Dr. Weldon in the margin read, "Quantum observation paradox. The act of prepared perception creating reality." The library lights flickered, and I realized I was alone in the building. The clock on the wall showed 7 minutes past midnight, though I'd arrived at 4. 6 hours vanished. On the table before me lay a photograph I hadn't retrieved from the motel, an enlarged section of the original church gathering, focusing solely on Emily's blurred face. As I stared, the blur seemed to resolve itself momentarily into distinct faces, each wearing a different expression, before dissolving back into chaos. My phone buzzed with another text. 3:27 approaches. "She's excited to meet you." I looked up to find myself surrounded by mirrors that hadn't been there before, arranged in a perfect circle around my table. In each reflection I saw myself, but slightly different, clothes varying, hair longer or shorter, expressions ranging from terror to calm acceptance. Between these reflections, standing in the spaces that shouldn't exist, was a small figure in white, Emily. Her face remained blurred in reality, but in each mirror it momentarily stabilized into a single child's face. Different in each reflection, the countless possibilities of who she might have been. "You understand now," came Dr. Weldon's voice from everywhere and nowhere. "Reality isn't fixed. Perception creates possibilities. Emily exists in all of them simultaneously." The mirrors began to rotate around me, picking up speed until they formed a silver blur. Through this mercurial barrier, I glimpsed a world of impossible geometry, where time moved in visible ripples and human figures existed as probability clouds rather than solid forms. At the center of it all stood Dr. Weldon, her outstretched hand holding Emily's, their bodies partially translucent, faces shifting between countless variations of themselves. "Join us," they spoke in perfect unison. "See everything at once." The mirrors splintered without sound, each fragment suspended mid-air like crystallized moments. I reached for Weldon's data on the table, but my hand passed through it as though it were smoke. The physical world had become as malleable as clay, responding to thought rather than touch. "Time isn't linear here," Weldon's voice explained, now coming from behind me. When I turned, she stood in ordinary clothes, her appearance solid except for her eyes, which contained reflected universes. "Emily showed me the truth. We perceive reality as fixed because our minds cannot comprehend simultaneity." I found my voice at last. "You've been gone 3 weeks. For you, perhaps." She smiled sadly. "I've experienced lifetimes, moments, centuries, all at once. Emily exists in quantum superposition, a state of all possibilities preserved. Her mother's grief was so profound it created a tear in reality, and Emily slipped through, becoming unstuck from linear time. The child appeared beside Weldon, her face still that maddening blur of possibilities, but her hand, when she reached toward me, was solid and small. "She's not a ghost," Weldon continued. "She's a child who exists in all possible states simultaneously. The original photographer didn't capture an anomaly. He documented reality's true nature. Around us, the library had dissolved into a space beyond description, colors that had no names, dimensions that folded into themselves. I could see backwards through my own timeline, myself as a child, as an unborn possibility, as future dust. Others came before us, I managed to say, remembering the photographer's decline, the missing collectors, the strange fates that befell those who noticed Emily. They weren't ready. Emily spoke, her voice a chorus of childish tones, some laughing, some whispering, some singing the same words in perfect harmony. Their minds couldn't accept seeing everything at once, but yours might. From this perspective beyond time, I could see the pattern. Thomas Merritt had glimpsed what his camera captured, and his mind broke trying to rationalize it. Each subsequent person who noticed Emily became entangled in her quantum state, pulled toward recognition of reality's fluid nature. "I have a choice," I stated, knowing it was true. "Everyone does." Weldon nodded. "I chose to step through. You can walk away, return to linear time, to comfortable illusion, but you'll never unsee what you've witnessed." Emily's blurred face seemed to tilt curiously. "Or you can learn to see properly, to exist as I do." I thought of Eliza Carter, who had glimpsed this truth as a child and spent a century pretending to recover. Of Helena Emerson, whose grief had torn reality. Of all those who had observed Emily and been forever changed. The clock that no longer existed showed 3:27. Decision time. "There's a third option," I said, my mind racing with implications. "I could tell your story, not as a warning, but as preparation." Emily's blur seemed to pause, the countless faces momentarily aligning into a single expression of surprise. Weldon's cosmic eyes widened. "Everyone who comes into contact with Emily either breaks or transcends," I continued. "What if there was another way? To create a bridge between perceptions?" The space around us rippled with possibility. Emily's small hand remained extended toward mine, an invitation, not a demand. Behind me lay the path back to linear time. Before me, quantum existence with no fixed point. I made my choice. The decision crystallized as I realized what Emily and Dr. Weldon couldn't see from their perspective beyond time, that stories themselves exist in quantum superposition until observed. By documenting Emily's impossible existence, I could create a bridge between realities that others might safely cross. I reached for Emily's hand, but instead of grasping it, I pressed Dr. Weldon's camera into her palm. "I'll be your witness, not your companion." The space around us convulsed, reality fracturing like ice on a spring pond. Emily's blur of faces registered something I hadn't seen before. Loneliness amid the infinite possibilities of her existence. "You would leave us here?" Weldon asked, her voice splitting into harmonics. "Not leave you," I explained. "Anchor you. Someone needs to remain in linear time to tell this story, to prepare others for what exists beyond perception." Emily tilted her blurred head, then raised the camera to what approximated her eye. The flash when it came was not light, but a momentary collapse of all possibilities into a single reality, just long enough for me to see her true face. Not monstrous or divine, simply a child caught between states, wearing an expression of profound understanding no 8-year-old should possess. "They will call you mad," Weldon warned, her form beginning to dissolve at the edges as though returning to probability. "Perhaps," I acknowledged. "But madness is just perception that doesn't align with consensus reality." Emily spoke one final time, her chorus of voices resolving into a single child's whisper. "I'll be watching. From every angle. Always." The fragmented mirrors reassembled themselves, spinning faster until they imploded into a single point of light. I found myself sitting at the library table, Dr. Weldon's research scattered before me. The clock showed 4:15. Only minutes had passed since my arrival. But the materials had changed. Equations were solved that had been incomplete before. Photographs showed angles that shouldn't exist, and a single Polaroid lay atop the pile, a clear image of Emily, her face finally resolved, holding Weldon's hand among strange geometries. On the back, in childish handwriting, "We are where possibilities never collapse." The library door opened and the archivist entered. The same woman who had helped me earlier, though now she gave no sign of recognition. "I'm sorry," she said, "but I don't recall admitting you. We've been closed for renovations since Tuesday." I checked my phone. 3 weeks had vanished, though I'd experienced mere minutes. Texts I'd sent to colleagues showed as delivered but never answered. My apartment lease had expired. The world had continued without me. As I gathered the research materials, my reflection in the window caught my attention. For just a moment, my face blurred slightly at the edges, looking in directions that shouldn't be possible. Emily was right. Once you've seen beyond the veil of linear perception, you never truly return unchanged. Part of me remained with her, just as she had left something of herself within me, the ability to glimpse, however briefly, the true nature of reality. I had my story now. The question was whether anyone was ready to hear it. As I walked away from the library that evening, research materials clutched against my chest. The world around me seemed different. Streetlights cast shadows that didn't quite align with their sources. Passers-by occasionally blurred at the edges when they moved too quickly. The boundaries between possibilities had thinned for me, permanently. I found temporary lodging in a small hotel near the edge of town, using what little remained in my bank account. The room's previous occupant had left behind a small desk mirror, which I immediately covered with a towel. Reflective surfaces had become doorways I wasn't prepared to open again, at least not yet. That night I began organizing Dr. Weldon's research, combining it with my own findings. A pattern emerged that I hadn't noticed before. St. Mary's Church wasn't the first structure built on that site. Historical maps revealed a succession of buildings dating back to the 1600s, each eventually abandoned after reports of structural anomalies or unsettling phenomena. Before European settlement, indigenous accounts described the area as a crossroads between worlds, to be approached only by trained spiritual leaders. More disturbing were the recurring incidents approximately every 33 years, the same span between Emily's appearance in the photograph and Dr. Weldon's disappearance. I found newspaper clippings documenting unexplained events in 1928, 1961, and 1994. Children reporting friends who could be everywhere at once. Adults experiencing temporal slippages where minutes or hours vanished. Photographers capturing inexplicable distortions. The cyclical nature suggested a pattern beyond coincidence. Something about that location thinned the barriers between possible realities at regular intervals, like cosmic tides responding to forces beyond our comprehension. Helena Emerson hadn't created the tear in reality. She'd merely found one that already existed and, through her grief, established contact with what lay beyond. Emily hadn't fallen through by accident. She'd been pulled across by a mother who refused to accept a single, unbearable reality. I verified this theory in land purchase records. Helena had specifically sought out that property after Emily's diagnosis, but before her death, paying far above market value to acquire it from reluctant sellers. She'd known something about that place, perhaps from local legends or whispered stories among the women of the community. What if Helena's madness had been calculation? What if she had deliberately positioned her dying daughter at a point where reality thinned, ensuring Emily wouldn't simply die, but would exist in all possible states simultaneously? A mother's desperate act of love, preserving her child by transforming her into something beyond death's reach. As dawn approached, I found myself staring at my uncovered phone screen, watching as text messages appeared and disappeared, communications from a realm where time worked differently, fragments from Dr. Weldon. The 33-year cycle peaks next Tuesday. Preparation essential. Others coming through. The most troubling message simply read, "Emily isn't the only one who found the gaps between realities. Some things were never human to begin with." I realized then that my role wasn't simply to document what had happened, but to prepare for what was coming. The barriers were thinning again, and Emily's story was just the beginning. The case of Emily Emerson consumed my thoughts as I pursued what felt like the only rational course of action. I needed to understand the 33-year cycle more completely, which meant finding witnesses from previous manifestations. With the next peak approaching rapidly, I abandoned my hotel room, pinning the research to the trunk of my car and heading toward the county nursing home. Records indicated 3 living residents had attended St. Mary's during the 1961 incident. 2 suffered from advanced dementia, but the third, Walter Havers, aged 87, was described as remarkably lucid in his medical chart. I found Walter in the recreation room, hands steady as he assembled a complex jigsaw puzzle. When I mentioned St. Mary's, his fingers froze mid-placement. "You've seen her," he whispered. Not a question, but a statement of fact. The girl who exists everywhere at once. Walter had been a teenager in 1961, working as an assistant to the church caretaker. He described finding strange objects in the church, items that hadn't been there the day before, appearing in locked rooms no one had entered. Small things at first, a hair ribbon, a child's drawing, then photographs no one had taken. His voice dropped lower. The worst was finding messages written in the dust on the pews each morning. Always the same words. "I'm still here, watching." The culmination came during an autumn service when every hymnal in the church simultaneously opened to different pages. Pages that, when read in sequence across the sanctuary, formed a coherent message. "Nobody else noticed," Walter said. "They just kept singing. But I saw it." The message said, "Reality is thin here. Others will come through." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a worn leather wallet. From a hidden compartment, he extracted a small photograph, edges yellowed with age. "Took this myself in '61. Never showed anyone. Knew they'd think me mad." The Polaroid showed the church altar, seemingly ordinary except for a faint, translucent figure standing beside it, a woman in outdated clothing from the turn of the century. Her face was clear enough to recognize Helena Emerson from historical photographs. She wasn't the only one, Walter continued. "For weeks I saw people from different times wandering near the church. They'd appear for moments, then vanish. Some looked confused, others purposeful, but they were all looking for something." He leaned closer, his breath smelling of peppermint and fear. "The 33-year cycle isn't about Emily reaching out. It's about the barriers wearing thin enough for others to notice the tear Helena created. Emily is just the most visible because she exists in quantum superposition, but there are others caught between realities." Walter's nurse approached, signaling the end of visiting hours. As I rose to leave, he gripped my wrist with surprising strength. "The Emerson property isn't just where reality thins," he whispered urgently. "It's where realities converge. Why do you think the railroad purchased that land? The tracks were never just for trains. They're a containment system, iron laid in specific patterns to stabilize the rupture." He pressed the photograph into my palm. "Find the original blueprints for those tracks." The engineer knew what he was building, and it wasn't just a railroad. The railroad plans proved maddeningly difficult to access. 3 days of bureaucratic obstruction finally gave way when I mentioned a specific name Walter had whispered to me as I left: Carlton Blackburn, chief engineer. The filing clerk's expression shifted from boredom to unease, and within an hour I was reviewing yellowed blueprints in a basement archive. What I found defied conventional engineering. The tracks near the Emerson property weren't laid in straight lines, but in subtle, complex geometrical patterns that formed perfect golden ratio spirals when viewed from above. Stranger still were Blackburn's marginalia, not the expected notations about grades and elevations, but esoteric symbols and equations that reminded me of Dr. Weldon's quantum calculations. A journal accompanied the blueprints, its leather cover worn smooth with age. Blackburn's elegant handwriting filled pages with observations that sounded more like metaphysics than civil engineering. The convergence point requires specific containment harmonics. Iron in precise geometric alignment creates resonant frequencies that stabilize the breach. We cannot close what Helena Emerson opened. The tear has existed too long and grown too powerful, but we can contain it within controlled parameters. Later entries grew more alarming. The child is not alone in the between spaces. During construction, 3 workers reported encounters with entities that wore human form imperfectly, as though trying on ill-fitting clothing. These others seemed drawn to the tear, seeking ingress to our reality. The final pages contained what appeared to be a warning. The containment pattern requires maintenance. Every 33 years, as celestial alignments amplify the breach, the iron must be reinforced according to the calculations herein. Failure to maintain the pattern will result in catastrophic reality destabilization. I checked the dates against railroad maintenance records. The pattern had been dutifully reinforced in 1928 and 1961. In 1994, partial work was completed before being abandoned due to budget cuts. For 2027, no maintenance was scheduled. The knowledge had been lost, the warning forgotten. I drove to the abandoned tracks as sunset painted the sky crimson. The rails remained, rusted and overgrown, but still forming their precise pattern around the former Emerson property. Kneeling to examine one section, I found the iron severely degraded, barely maintaining structural integrity. My phone chimed with a message from the unknown number. They're already coming through where the pattern has weakened. As if in confirmation, I heard a sound like tearing fabric. Across the field, the air seemed to ripple and fold, creating a momentary window into somewhere else, a landscape of impossible architecture where multiple versions of the same buildings occupied identical space. Standing at this window between worlds was a figure that resembled a woman, but moved wrong, joints bending in directions human anatomy shouldn't allow. She turned toward me with a face that shifted between features, never settling on one configuration. Not Emily, not Helena. Something else that had found the tier between realities and was learning to step through. Behind me, my car radio switched on by itself, scanning through stations until it settled on static. From within the white noise, a child's voice, Emily's, spoke with desperate clarity. The others want what she gave me, a way to exist everywhere at once. The railroad maintenance logs had missed a critical detail I discovered while tracing Blackburn's personal correspondence in the county archives. The iron rails weren't merely physical barriers, they had been forged with specific material compositions, including meteorite fragments Blackburn had specially acquired from an astronomical society in 1897. Otherworldly iron to contain otherworldly breaches, he'd written to a metallurgist colleague. The meteor that fell in '57 contains elements unknown to our periodic tables. When shaped according to the sacred geometries, it creates a resonance that harmonizes divergent realities. This explained why the containment was failing despite the rails still being physically present. The unique metallurgical properties were degrading over time, a process accelerated by the electromagnetic fields generated by modern technology. What had once been a meticulously calculated barrier had become little more than suggestive geometry. I established a makeshift monitoring station in my car, parking at the edge of the Emerson property with equipment borrowed from a physicist friend, who now wasn't returning my increasingly desperate messages. Simple electromagnetic field detectors showed massive fluctuations increasing in both frequency and intensity as Tuesday approached. Local wildlife sensed the wrongness. Birds avoided flying over the property, creating a perfect arc of empty sky above the convergence point. At night, the absence of insect sounds created a dome of silence that pressed against my ears like cotton wool. The most disturbing development came when I reviewed photographs taken across multiple days from the same position. Landmarks in the background, trees, fence posts, distant buildings, subtly changed position between images. Though I had used a tripod in precisely the same location, space itself was becoming unstable around the property. On Monday evening, less than 24 hours before the predicted peak, I received a final communication from Dr. Weldon that chilled me to my core. The others have been watching humanity through Emily for decades. They've learned how to wear our forms convincingly now. Some have already crossed over where the containment is weakest. Look for people who cast shadows that move independently of their bodies. Trust no one who cannot remember specific details of shared experiences. I thought of the archivist who hadn't recognized me, the motel clerk whose silhouette remained unnaturally still. Had they already been replaced? How many others had slipped through the weakened barriers, wearing human faces like masks? That night, I dreamed of Emily standing at the convergence point, her blurred face momentarily resolving into an expression of terror. Behind her, countless entities pressed against the thinning veil between realities, their forms constantly shifting as they tested which human appearances might allow them passage undetected. They want to do to everyone what happened to me, Emily's voice echoed. To exist in all states simultaneously. But humans aren't meant for that. It would unmake your world. I awoke at 3:27, not to my alarm, but to a perfect silence that seemed to swallow even my heartbeat. Outside my car window, the air above the Emerson Foundation rippled like heat waves in winter. Impossible. Wrong. Something was coming through. The first light of dawn broke as I stumbled from my car, drawn toward the Emerson Foundation by forces I couldn't resist. The air had become viscous, each step requiring deliberate effort, as though reality itself objected to my approach. The rusty rails of Blackburn's containment pattern glowed with a faint blue luminescence that pulsed in rhythmic sequence, dying embers of a once powerful barrier. Through my viewer, I could see what remained invisible to the naked eye. tears in the fabric of space hovering above the foundation stones like jagged wounds, each rippled with possibilities, glimpses of worlds where the Emerson house still stood, where it had burned, where it had transformed into something architecture couldn't define. Emily stood at the center where all possibilities converged, no longer merely a child, but a nexus of quantum potential. Her form flickered between states. The 8-year-old from the photograph, a teenager she never lived to become, an elderly woman from a timeline where she'd survived. Behind her, pressing against the thinning barriers, shapes moved with calculated purpose. "They've been patient," Emily's chorus of voices whispered, somehow audible despite the distance between us. "For over a century, they've studied us through these gaps, learning how humanity perceives reality, how to mimic it." I recognized Dr. Weldon among the figures surrounding Emily, her form translucent but recognizable. She frantically arranged small objects in patterns across the ground. Mirrors, pieces of iron, crystalline structures that hurt my eyes when I looked directly at them. "We're trying to reinforce what remains," Weldon called, her voice echoing as though spoken both forwards and backwards in time. The original mathematician, Blackburn, he understood. The pattern isn't just physical, it's mathematical. The equation written in iron across the land. Around the perimeter, dark figures had begun to materialize, human in general outline but wrong in crucial details. Their movements were too fluid, joints bending in impossible directions. Their faces seemed projected rather than organic, expressions shifting without musculature. Most disturbing were their eyes, flat and observational, windows through which something else watched our world with clinical interest. "If they fully materialize," Emily warned, "the barriers collapse permanently. All possibilities will exist simultaneously everywhere." I understood then what Helena Emerson had inadvertently done. In saving her daughter from death's finality, she'd created a precedent, proving that with sufficient emotional energy, the fixed points of reality could be unwritten. The others had watched, learned, and now sought to exploit this vulnerability on a global scale. My phone vibrated with incoming messages, not from Weldon or Emily, but from people throughout town. Strange sightings, people acting unlike themselves, mirrors showing reflections that moved independently. The breach was widening. Walter Haver's final whispered instruction now made terrible sense. "The pattern needs blood from the original breach. Only an Emerson can repair what an Emerson opened." I looked down at the genealogy records I'd brought with me, the family tree I'd traced through century-old documents and DNA databases. The truth I'd been avoiding since this investigation began. My great-grandmother's maiden name, Emerson, Helena's niece, who'd left town shortly after the incidents of 1895. I was the last living descendant. The realization of my bloodline hit with the weight of generations. I was never randomly drawn to this investigation. Emily had been calling to her own family across decades and quantum states. Standing at the boundary of Blackburn's failing containment pattern, I removed the small pocket knife I always carried. The metal felt unusually warm against my palm, as though responding to proximity with the otherworldly iron in the rails. "Blood freely given reinforces intent," came Walter's voice from a memory that suddenly felt suspiciously planted. Had he known all along? Had they all been guiding me here? The others had fully materialized at the perimeter now, their not quite human forms circling the foundation like predators. Wherever they stepped, reality rippled outward, distorting the landscape. Trees bent in impossible angles. Grass grew and withered in seconds. The boundary between worlds thinned with each passing moment. I sliced my palm, the sharp sting grounding me in physical reality, as warmth trickled between my fingers. Emily's kaleidoscope face turned toward me, momentarily resolving into a single expression: recognition. "The pattern!" Weldon shouted, her form flickering between present and absent states. "Complete the pattern with the blood." I moved to the nearest rail, letting crimson drops fall onto the rusted iron. At contact, the metal flared with renewed luminescence, the blue glow intensifying and spreading along the geometric pattern like wildfire. The others recoiled, their forms destabilizing where the light touched them. But there were too many gaps, too much degradation in the century-old containment system. My blood could strengthen what remained, but couldn't replace what had been lost to time and neglect. As I frantically moved from section to section, completing what segments I could reach, Emily appeared beside me, not the distant figure at the center, but a quantum echo of her, overlapping multiple states of being simultaneously. "Not enough," Her chorus of voices whispered, "The mathematics are incomplete." "What do we need?" I asked, desperate as the others regrouped, learning to avoid the reinforced sections. Emily's hand touched my bleeding palm, her fingers passing partially through my flesh while simultaneously feeling solid against my skin, an impossible sensation that sent electricity shooting up my arm. "The original photograph," she said. "It captured the moment of first breach. Images hold power. Their quantum observations fixed in physical form." I remembered the reproduction in my research materials, the church gathering with Emily's blurred face in the front row, not the original glass plate. Long lost, but perhaps enough. As I turned toward my car, the air solidified around me. The others had created a barrier of their own, reality hardening into impenetrable walls. Their not-quite faces watched with calculated interest as I struggled against the invisible force. From beyond the perimeter, car headlights appeared, vehicles approaching along the old access road. Local people drawn by the increasing anomalies, unknowing witnesses about to encounter horrors beyond comprehension. The clock on my phone displayed 3:27. The cycle had peaked. Time was up. As the vehicles drew closer, I recognized familiar faces behind windshields. The librarian who'd helped me, the farmer who'd given me Dr. Weldon's notebook, even the motel clerk whose stillness had unnerved me. They weren't others as I'd feared. They were townspeople who'd been watching, waiting, preparing without my knowledge. They positioned their vehicles in precise locations, headlights illuminating sections of Blackburn's pattern that had faded beyond visibility. The beams completed geometric lines the physical rails no longer maintained, light substituting for degraded iron, ancient mathematics reconstructed through modern means. "The convergence has drawn guardians for generations," Emily's multi-voice explained as she flickered beside me. "Helena didn't discover this place by accident. Our family has always been tied to it." The barrier around me weakened as the others diverted attention to the newcomers. I broke free, sprinting toward my car as reality buckled underfoot, distances expanding and contracting unpredictably. The photograph waited in my research files, a simple reproduction on ordinary paper. It seemed absurdly mundane, considering the weight now placed upon it. As my fingers touched it, the image shifted beneath my gaze, Emily's blurred face momentarily resolving into clarity, before fracturing into countless expressions again. Walter Havers emerged from the lead vehicle, looking decades younger than the nursing home resident I'd interviewed. He carried an antique camera that could only be Thomas Merritt's original equipment. "Cycles repeat, but never exactly," he called over the growing maelstrom of collapsing possibility waves. Blackburn contained what Helena opened. Weldon understood what Blackburn built. Now we merge all approaches. The townspeople moved with practiced coordination, arranging mirrors in a secondary pattern outside the rails. Each reflected the headlights in calculated angles, creating a lattice of light that intersected above the foundation. I pressed my bleeding palm against the photograph, feeling it absorb my offering. The paper warmed, then began emitting the same blue luminescence as the reinforced rails. The image itself changed, the church gathering disappearing to reveal the true mathematical equation hidden within the composition, the photographer's unconscious capture of reality's fundamental formula. The others sensed what was happening. Their approximations of human form dissolved into their true nature, mathematically perfect structures of impossible geometry, consciousness as pure calculation. They rushed toward me as I held the glowing photograph aloft. "The original breach was created through love," Emily said, her form stabilizing momentarily. "It can only be sealed the same way." I understood then why it had to be an Emerson. Not just the blood connection, but the emotional resonance, the capacity to love someone across all possible realities, as Helena had loved her daughter. I focused every thought on Emily, not as the quantum anomaly she'd become, but as the child she'd been, a girl who deserved the chance to exist in one reality, fully and completely, rather than fragmented across infinite possibilities. The photograph flared with blinding intensity. The impossible mathematics of existence rearranged themselves around us, and Emily smiled, with one face, one expression, in one moment that belonged solely to itself. The light faded gradually, revealing a transformed landscape around the Emerson Foundation. The pattern of iron and light had coalesced into something new, a boundary not of exclusion but of definition. Reality had been reshaped, given structure where it had begun to dissolve. Emily stood before me, no longer a quantum blur but a solid child in a white dress. Her face, singular, fixed, beautiful in its simplicity, regarded me with eyes that held both ancient wisdom and childlike wonder. "You've given me the greatest gift," she said, her voice now a single clear tone instead of the chorus that had haunted my recordings. Singularity. The others had retreated beyond the new boundary, their mathematical forms visible now only as distortions at the periphery of perception. They hadn't been banished entirely. Such forces could never be completely eliminated, but they had lost their foothold in our reality. Walter approached, the antique camera hanging loosely from its leather strap around his neck. "Your family has guarded this secret for generations," he explained. "Helena wasn't mad. She was a mathematician beyond her time. She discovered what quantum physicists wouldn't understand for another century. The Emerson equation," Dr. Weldon added, her form now fully present rather than flickering between states. "The mathematical proof that observation doesn't just influence reality, it creates it. Helena used grief as the catalyst, but the principle transcends emotion." The townspeople moved among the pattern, securing weakened points, strengthening the new boundary. They worked with the precision of those who had rehearsed this moment for lifetimes. "We've been preparing for this cycle since 1994, when we realized the pattern was degrading beyond repair," Walter continued. "Each 33-year peak weakened the original containment further. We needed an Emerson to complete what Helena began." I looked at the photograph in my hands, now transformed into something that resembled an elegant proof, written in glowing symbols I recognized from Blackburn's journals. "You led me here deliberately. We sent the signals," Emily acknowledged. "Across quantum states I could reach you, like calling to like across generations, but only you could choose to answer." Dr. Weldon placed a hand on my shoulder, her touch confirming her return to conventional reality. "The breach isn't sealed. It can never be fully closed, but it's defined now, contained within parameters that allow for communication without collapse." Emily stepped forward, taking my still bleeding hand in hers. Where our skin met, small sparks of blue light danced between us, Emerson blood recognizing its own. "I don't have to be everywhere at once anymore," she whispered, "but I'm not trapped in a single state either. I exist, precisely as I should." The implications staggered me. Emily wasn't going to disappear, nor would she remain as the fragmented entity she'd been. Something new had been created, a consciousness that could move between states by choice, rather than existing in all simultaneously. "What happens now?" I asked, looking around at the gathered guardians and the shimmering boundary they'd helped create. Emily smiled, a single perfect expression. "Now we learn what it means to exist in harmony with possibility, rather than being torn apart by it." The fading twilight cast long shadows across the Emerson Foundation as I stood beside Emily, watching the townspeople secure the new boundary. My bleeding hand had stopped hurting, though the wound remained open, a living connection to the mathematical reality we'd just reshaped. "They'll come again," Emily said softly, her gaze fixed on the distortions hovering at the pattern's edge. "The others, they're patient. They've waited a century already." "But we'll be ready," Walter replied, adjusting one of the mirrors to strengthen a section where the light wavered. "The pattern is stronger now, built on understanding rather than desperation." I studied the transformed photograph in my hand, the church gathering now replaced by equations that seemed to shift subtly as I watched, adapting to some unseen cosmic rhythm. "Helena didn't just save you, did she? She discovered something fundamental about reality." Dr. Weldon nodded, her earlier quantum instability now resolved into focused purpose. "Reality isn't fixed, it's negotiable. Most people live their entire lives without realizing how malleable existence truly is. Helena's grief created a tear, but her mathematical genius made it stable. The church, I realized suddenly. It was built there deliberately, wasn't it? A sacred space over a convergence point. Long before Europeans arrived, one of the townspeople confirmed. Indigenous peoples recognized this place as special. Then the church, then Helena's calculations, then Blackburn's containment pattern. Each generation adding their understanding to manage what exists here. Emily slipped her small hand into mine, her touch both impossibly old and perfectly childlike. "I can show you what I've seen," she offered. "Not everything at once, that would break your mind, but glimpses of what exists beyond conventional perception." The surrounding townspeople began packing equipment into their vehicles. their practiced movements suggesting this wasn't their first time managing such an event. They moved with the quiet confidence of those who had inherited a sacred duty. "The 33-year cycle isn't ending," Walter explained, seeing my questioning look. "We've simply redirected it. Instead of weakening reality, it will now serve as a maintenance schedule." Dr. Weldon laughed softly. "That's one way to put it. In scientific terms, we've established a controlled quantum observation point, a place where realities can be studied without collapsing into chaos." Behind us, the farmer who'd given me Dr. Weldon's notebook approached with a leather-bound journal. "Your turn to record," he said, pressing it into my hands. "Each Emerson adds their chapter." I opened the book to find generations of writing, beginning with Helena's precise notations, continuing through descendants I hadn't known existed. The most recent entry was dated 33 years ago, written by a distant cousin who'd died before I was born. "You're not just an Emerson by blood," Emily whispered. "You're an observer. Someone who can see the spaces between conventional reality without being destroyed by the knowledge." As the last light faded, the mathematical boundary glowed with increasing intensity, casting blue luminescence across our faces. Emily's expression remained singular but knowing, a child who had experienced eternity and returned with something precious. "Welcome home," she said simply, and I understood that my investigation hadn't led me to a conclusion, but to a beginning. I stared at the journal in my hands, understanding dawning as I flipped through generations of observations and equations. This wasn't just a family legacy. It was a scientific continuum stretching back through time, documenting humanity's interaction with quantum reality through the lens of a single bloodline. "The others aren't evil," Emily said, reading my thoughts with uncanny precision. "They simply exist according to different rules. Their reality is probability-based rather than fixed. They find our certainty fascinating." Dr. Weldon nodded, checking readings on equipment the townspeople had positioned around the boundary. "In their realm, all possibilities exist simultaneously. They don't understand why we choose just one. To them, we're deliberately amputating infinite potential, which is why they were drawn to Emily." I realized. She became a bridge between understanding, experiencing multiple states while retaining human consciousness. The boundary pulsed in a steady rhythm now, like a heartbeat synchronizing dimensions. Through it, I caught glimpses of landscapes that defied description, spaces where geometry folded back upon itself, where colors existed that human eyes couldn't process. "Every 33 years, the work passes to a new observer," Walter explained. "Not always an Emerson by blood, but always someone connected to the convergence point. The pattern needs tending, like any living thing." Emily squeezed my hand. "I'll help you understand. I've had a century to learn how to exist between states. It gets easier with practice. For the first time since discovering the photograph, I felt something like peace settling over me. The mystery hadn't been solved so much as incorporated into a larger understanding, one that stretched backward through generations and forward into futures not yet realized." "Will I see you again?" I asked Emily, suddenly uncertain as the boundary stabilized, separating our realities with gentle but firm mathematics. She smiled, that single perfect expression that had taken a century to achieve. "I exist in one place now, but that place isn't bound by conventional space-time. I'll be here when the boundary thins, and sometimes..." She glanced meaningfully at reflective surfaces around us. "I'll check in through doorways that remain open." Dr. Weldon handed me a small mirror in an iron frame. "For emergencies only," she cautioned. "The boundary works both ways, keeping them from fully entering our reality, but also protecting humanity from the psychological effects of perceiving infinite possibility." As dawn broke over the horizon, Emily began to fade from view, not blurring into quantum uncertainty as before, but simply stepping back behind the mathematical curtain we had created. "Every photograph captures more than light," she said as she receded. "It captures possibility. Remember that when you look at old images and see something unexpected at the edges. We're always watching, from every angle at once." Her final words hung in the air long after she had disappeared completely. Reality is what we collectively agree to see. Change the observation, change the world. The journal in my hand seemed heavier now with the weight of responsibility, not a burden, but a continuation of something profound that stretched beyond a single lifetime. The boundary has held for nearly 3 decades now, though not without moments of strain. I've documented each incident meticulously in the Emerson Journal. watching my handwriting gradually transform from the uncertain scrawl of a reluctant observer to the precise notations of someone who has glimpsed behind reality's curtain. Last night I felt it again, that peculiar thinning of the air that precedes Emily's appearances. She manifests rarely, conserving her energy for important communications. When the bathroom mirror clouded over at precisely 3:27, I wasn't surprised to see her reflection instead of mine. "They've found another way," she said without preamble, her singular face now showing subtle signs of aging, a quantum being growing alongside the linear progression of my own life. "The others have discovered something Helena never anticipated." She explained the terrible truth that Helena Emerson had taken to her grave. The convergence point wasn't created by grief or mathematics. It had always existed. What made it unique was that Helena had managed to establish communication without madness, using her daughter as the conduit. "My mother didn't save me from death," Emily revealed, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent reviewing her own existence from every possible angle. "She sacrificed me to it, deliberately. The scarlet fever was her creation, a calculated illness to place me at the threshold between states." The journal entries suddenly made horrifying sense. Helena's background wasn't merely mathematical. She had studied with occultists in Europe before returning to America. The equations masqueraded as physics, but contained elements of ritual, designed to transform a dying child into a quantum anchor. "The others aren't trying to break through anymore," Emily continued, her image rippling as though the mirror struggled to contain her. "They've learned from us. They're creating their own anchors, children placed deliberately at convergence points around the world." I thought of the news reports I'd been monitoring. Unexplained phenomena increasing globally, concentrated around hospitals and schools. Children reporting invisible friends who existed everywhere and nowhere. Adults experiencing temporal slippages near certain geographic coordinates. "The 33-year cycle was never about celestial alignments," Emily whispered. "It was about human generations. How long it takes to prepare a new observer, or a new sacrifice." The truth sent ice through my veins. Helena Emerson hadn't been protecting humanity. She'd been engaging in negotiation with entities beyond conventional understanding. Each cycle wasn't maintenance but payment, an offering of consciousness to maintain a treaty between realities. "Your blood renewed the covenant," Emily said, her expression grave. "But they want more now. A full transition, not just observation." As her image began to fade, Emily pressed her hand against the glass. Where her fingers touched, the mirror retained perfect impressions. 5 small portals showing glimpses of what existed beyond our reality. "The final equation was never recorded," she said. "Helena destroyed it after using it on me. You must find it before they recreate it themselves." The revelation about Helena's true motives shattered everything I thought I knew about my family legacy. What I had interpreted as a mother's desperate attempt to save her child was actually a calculated sacrifice, a cold, mathematical bargain with entities beyond our understanding. The guardian role passed through generations of Emersons wasn't protection, but continuation of this cosmic treaty. I spent 3 days examining the journal entries with new eyes, searching for coded information Helena might have hidden. What appeared to be simple mathematical notations now revealed themselves as something far more sinister. Formulas for preparing a human consciousness to serve as a quantum anchor, with Emily as the prototype. The mirrors Dr. Weldon had given me remained covered except when absolutely necessary. Each time I used one, I noticed subtle changes in my reflection, a slight delay in movements, a momentary superposition of expressions. The boundary was affecting me too. Walter called yesterday, his voice trembling with urgency. "They've found a child in Mapleton, 6 years old. Parents report she's begun describing places she couldn't possibly know about, and appearing in multiple rooms simultaneously." The pattern was beginning again, but not on our timeline. The others were accelerating the cycle, creating their own convergence points, rather than waiting for natural thinning. The treaty was being rewritten without our consent. I drove to the address Walter provided, finding a modern suburban home surrounded by concerned neighbors. Inside, the parents sat shell-shocked on their couch, while upstairs, quantum ripples distorted the air around a small bedroom door. "She was fine until last week," the mother whispered, staring vacantly at family photos on the wall. Then she started talking about the everywhere people who wanted to teach her how to be everywhere too. In the girls' room, crayon drawings covered the walls, hundreds of them, each showing the same scene from slightly different angles simultaneously. as though the child had documented multiple overlapping realities. In the center of each drawing stood a figure in white with a blurred face. Not Emily, something pretending to be Emily. On the child's desk sat an antique mirror in an iron frame, identical to the one Dr. Weldon had given me for emergencies. When I approached it, my reflection showed someone else's eyes staring back. I understood then what Helena had truly created. Not just a passage between realities, but a template that could be reproduced. The final equation wasn't hidden in old journals or buried in the Emerson Foundation. It existed in Emily herself, in the specific quantum configuration Helena had imposed upon her daughter's consciousness. The others didn't need to break through our barrier. They had learned to create their own Emily, their own anchors in our reality. As I stood in that child's room, watching reality ripple around her sleeping form, I realized the true horror of our situation. The 33-year containment pattern wasn't failing because of neglect. It was being systematically dismantled by entities that had spent a century studying its design from the inside. We hadn't secured a boundary. We had provided the blueprint for its destruction. My desperate search for Helena's final equation led me to the one place I'd avoided, St. Mary's Cemetery, where her grave remained untended for over a century. Under moonlight, I carefully removed decades of soil from the weathered headstone. The inscription held nothing unusual, but my fingers detected subtle irregularities in the stone's surface. Mathematical symbols carved so shallowly they'd been obscured by time and elements. I made rubbings of these hidden markings, recognizing components of the quantum formulas from the journal, but arranged in a sequence I'd never seen. This wasn't just the final equation, it was its reversal. Helena's contingency plan, her cosmic escape clause from whatever bargain she'd struck. The young girl in Mapleton worsened as reality fractured around her. Her parents reported multiple versions of their daughter appearing throughout the house simultaneously, each slightly different, each existing in overlapping states. The others were recreating Emily's condition, but without the stabilizing influence of the Emerson bloodline. I gathered the remaining guardians at the convergence point, Walter, Dr. Weldon, and townspeople who'd inherited this burden across generations. We arranged mirrors and iron in Helena's reversal pattern, creating not a boundary, but a funnel, a directed channel between realities. This will collapse the treaty completely, Dr. Weldon warned. Whatever protection the original arrangement provided will be gone. It was never protection, I replied, understanding Helena's true design at last. It was containment, not just keeping them out, but keeping Emily in. She's been their prisoner for over a century. The photograph that had started my journey, that impossible image of a child looking in every direction at once, I placed at the center of our arrangement. No longer a reproduction, but the original glass plate negative, recovered from the abandoned railroad office where Blackburn had hidden it, the true record of the moment when realities first merged. As we completed Helena's reversal formula, the photograph began to glow with that now familiar blue luminescence. The image changed before our eyes, Emily's blurred face resolving into perfect clarity, while everything around her, the parishioners, the church, the pastor, dissolved into quantum uncertainty, a perfect inversion of what had happened in 1895. Through the mirrors came Emily's voice, now speaking with newfound authority. Helena knew they would eventually learn to create their own anchors. The treaty wasn't to protect humanity. It was to buy time until we understood enough to fight back. The air above the Emerson Foundation tore open, not into the mathematical realm of the others, but into a new space, a reality Emily had been constructing during her century of quantum existence, built according to rules neither fully human nor other, but balanced between. "The child in Mapleton," I gasped, understanding at last. "Will be the first I save," Emily confirmed. "What was done to me need not be their fate. Helena made me a prisoner to protect the world. You've made me its guardian instead." As the new passage stabilized, I saw what my great-grandaunt had truly sacrificed her daughter to create, not merely an observer of quantum realities, but their eventual mediator. The convergence of realities continued long after that night at the Emerson Foundation, not as the catastrophe we feared, but as something more profound, a negotiated balance. Emily exists now in that liminal space she created, neither fully human nor other, rescuing children targeted for quantum anchoring while maintaining boundaries between worlds that were never meant to fully merge. I visit the site on equinoxes and solstices, those thin moments when communication flows more easily across the barrier. Sometimes Emily appears as the child from the photograph, sometimes as the woman she might have become, sometimes as something beyond conventional description, a presence that radiates understanding beyond words. Helena knew the price of knowledge, Emily told me during our last meeting. She calculated her own daughter's sacrifice against the weight of human consciousness remaining singular and fixed. She wasn't cruel, she was terrified. The Mapleton girl recovered gradually, her fractured states resolving into a single coherence. She remembers her time of quantum superposition as, "when I was everywhere," speaking of it with the innocent wonder of childhood rather than the cosmic horror adults would feel. Emily visits her dreams, teaching her to maintain her singular existence, while remaining aware of the infinite possibilities that branch from every moment. Others have emerged worldwide, children approaching dangerous thresholds of perception, adults whose grief or genius or madness accidentally pierce the veil between states. Emily finds them all, guiding them back from the brink of dissolution. I continue documenting everything in the journal, understanding now that our family's true purpose was never merely observation, but preparation. Helena sacrificed her daughter, knowing that someday, the knowledge gained would allow humanity to negotiate with the infinite rather than being consumed by it. The others still press against the boundaries of our reality, fascinated by our linear existence, our commitment to singular states. They cannot understand why we choose one possibility when we could experience all. But they have learned to respect the negotiated peace Emily maintains, a treaty not of surrender but of mutual recognition. Yesterday, I received a package containing Thomas Merritt's original camera, somehow preserved across more than a century. With it came a note in Emily's handwriting. The final equation isn't mathematical, it's perceptual. Humans can accommodate multiple realities without fracturing if they understand they're looking at reflections, not absolutes. Tonight I'll use Merritt's camera at the convergence point during the winter solstice, not to capture what exists beyond our reality, but to document the boundary itself, the beautiful mathematics of limitation that allow consciousness to flourish within structure. Emily was never meant to remain trapped between states eternally. Helena's true endgame, hidden within equations spanning generations of Emerson observers, was to create a consciousness that could eventually navigate between realities by choice rather than compulsion. The others watch us still, from every angle at once. But now, we watch them too. I stand at my desk surrounded by 100 years of evidence, equations, and correspondence, the visible architecture of an invisible bridge between realities. Merritt's camera sits beside a modern digital one, both trained on the same subject, the original church gathering photograph, now restored to its conventional appearance, showing parishioners, pastor, and a small girl with a perfectly normal face in the front row. To the untrained eye, Emily Emerson now appears as she should have, a child of 8, standing still for the camera's long exposure. No blur, no quantum superposition, no faces looking in every direction at once. Only those of us who know the truth can still see the faint mathematics shimmering beneath the surface image. Helena's cosmic bargain, written in silver and light rather than blood and iron. My role has evolved from investigator to custodian. The 33-year cycle approaches its next peak, not as crisis but as opportunity. In households across the world, children who see from every angle at once are no longer sedated or institutionalized, but gently guided by a network of observers trained to recognize the signs of quantum perception. Emily makes herself known through reflections, photographs, and dreams, never fully manifesting in our reality again, but maintaining her position at the boundary. The others remain beyond the veil, studying us with their mathematical curiosity while we study them in return. A cold war of realities, held in check by a child who became something greater than either side anticipated. Last week, I received an unexpected package from Eliza Carter's estate. She had died at 105, the last living witness to the original convergence. Among her personal effects was a sealed envelope addressed to the current Emerson observer, containing a single Polaroid photograph. It shows Emily as she exists now, not the child from 1895, but the entity she has become. She stands at the center point between realities, innumerable versions of herself extending outward like petals of a cosmic flower, each representing a different possibility of her existence. Yet unlike the terrifying blur from the original photograph, this multiplicity appears harmonious, controlled, a conscious choice rather than an imposed state. On the back, in Eliza's shaky handwriting, she visits me still. Not a haunting, but a blessing. She wanted you to see her as she truly is. I've added this final piece to the archive, completing the circle Helena began with her desperate mathematics. What started as a mother's refusal to accept death became humanity's first embassy to the infinite. As I prepare to visit the convergence point tonight, I realize the true legacy of Emily Emerson wasn't just to serve as quantum anchor or boundary guardian, but to demonstrate that consciousness can expand beyond conventional limits without losing its essential humanity. The church gathering photograph sits innocently in its frame, looking like any other historical image to those who haven't learned to see properly. But for those of us who know to look between the fixed moments, between the singular states of what was and what might have been, the truth remains visible. There are faces looking from every angle, watching, waiting for us to understand reality's fluid nature. Another photograph, another dark secret revealed. Until next time, this has been Shadow Frames.